Picture this. You're lying in bed tonight, drifting off to sleep, when a chilling thought crosses your mind. What if you never truly die? What if every time death approaches, your consciousness somehow slips away into another reality where you survive? What if you're trapped in an endless cycle of existence, watching everyone you love fade away while you remain, growing older and more isolated with each passing century? This isn't science fiction. This is quantum immortality, and it's a theory that has genuinely terrified some of the brightest minds in physics. Because if it's true, death as we understand it might be nothing more than an illusion, and consciousness might be condemned to experience reality forever. Welcome back to the channel where we explore the most mind-bending concepts in science. I'm thrilled you're here with me tonight as we dive into one of the most disturbing theories in modern physics. Before we begin this journey into the darkest corners of quantum mechanics, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you tucked in bed in London at midnight? Or perhaps it's afternoon where you are and you're taking a break from work? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, if you're new here, this channel is dedicated to exploring the strange, the beautiful, and yes, sometimes the terrifying aspects of our universe. We tackle complex scientific concepts with the depth they deserve, but in a way that anyone can understand. And if you enjoy content like this, hitting that subscribe button really helps this small channel grow. Tonight's topic might just change the way you think about existence itself. We're going to explore quantum immortality, a theory so unsettling that even its creators have stepped back from its implications. We'll uncover why this concept has sparked heated debates in physics conferences, why mental health professionals are genuinely concerned about its psychological impact, and why some scientists consider it one of the most dangerous ideas in theoretical physics. But here's what makes this particularly fascinating and terrifying. This isn't just abstract philosophy. The theory emerges from legitimate quantum mechanics, built on mathematical foundations that have proven remarkably successful in other areas of physics. It's rooted in equations that work, in principles that have revolutionized our understanding of reality. And yet, when these same principles are applied to consciousness and death, they produce conclusions that feel almost too disturbing to contemplate. What we're about to explore tonight goes far beyond typical scientific speculation. This is a theory that forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, the meaning of death, and whether our actions have any real consequences. It's a concept that has driven some researchers to question not just physics, but the very foundation of what it means to be human. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to have your assumptions about mortality challenged in ways you never imagined. Because by the end of this exploration, you might find yourself lying awake tonight, wondering if consciousness truly can escape the one certainty we've all taken for granted. The story of quantum immortality begins in 1957 with a brilliant but troubled physicist named Hugh Everett III. Everett was working on his doctoral thesis at Princeton University when he proposed something so radical, so completely at odds with accepted physics, that his own advisor initially refused to support it. What Everett suggested was that reality itself splits every time a quantum measurement occurs, creating parallel universes where every possible outcome actually happens. This wasn't just another interpretation of quantum mechanics. This was a complete reimagining of existence itself. Everett called it the many worlds interpretation, and it painted a picture of reality that was both magnificent and terrifying. According to his theory, every quantum event, every subatomic decision, every moment of uncertainty in the universe creates a branching point where reality divides like the limbs of an infinite tree. The scientific establishment reacted with horror. Niels Bohr, one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, dismissed Everett's work with barely concealed contempt. Other physicists treated it as philosophical speculation rather than serious science. Everett found himself ostracized. his brilliant career derailed by ideas too strange for his contemporaries to accept. But here's where the story takes a deeply personal and disturbing turn. Everett didn't just propose the many worlds interpretation as an abstract theory. He believed in it completely, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. According to biographical accounts, Everett firmly believed that his many worlds theory guaranteed him immortality. His consciousness, he argued, was bound at each branching point to follow whatever path did not lead to death. Think about the implications of what Everett was suggesting. In his view, every time he faced a potentially fatal situation, the universe would split. In some branches, he would die, but in at least one branch, he would survive. And since consciousness could only exist in the branches where he lived, he would subjectively experience only the survival outcomes. From his perspective, he would seem impossibly lucky, dodging death again and again through increasingly improbable circumstances. Everett never wavered in this belief, even as his ideas were rejected by the physics community. He maintained absolute faith in his theory until his death in 1982, convinced that somewhere in some parallel universe, versions of himself continued to exist, perhaps still working on physics problems in realities where his ideas had been accepted. But Everett's personal conviction was just the beginning. Decades later, other physicists would take his ideas and push them to even more disturbing conclusions. In 1997, a physicist at MIT named Max Tegmark decided to test the logical implications of the many worlds interpretation. Tegmark was brilliant, respected, and thoroughly rational, which makes what he proposed all the more chilling. He designed a thought experiment that would become known as quantum suicide, and it represented quantum immortality in its purest and most terrifying form. Tegmark's experiment was elegantly simple and absolutely horrifying. Imagine a device that measures the quantum spin of a single particle. If the particle spins one way, nothing happens. If it spins the other way, the device instantly kills the experimenter. According to the many worlds interpretation, each measurement splits reality into two branches, one where the experimenter lives, one where they die. Here's where quantum immortality reveals its true horror. From the experimenter's perspective, they would only ever experience the branches where they survive, because consciousness cannot observe its own non-existence. They could run the experiment 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, and from their subjective viewpoint, they would always find themselves alive, growing increasingly convinced that they had proven their own immortality. But Tegmark quickly realized the nightmarish implications of his own thought experiment. He began to distance himself from the practical applications of quantum immortality, emphasizing that the experiment was purely theoretical and should never be attempted. He understood that the theory, if taken seriously, could lead people to test it in ways that would be catastrophically dangerous. The quantum suicide experiment reveals something deeply unsettling about quantum immortality. It's not just about surviving death, it's about being trapped in an existence where death becomes impossible to achieve, even when desperately desired. It's about watching probability itself bend around you in increasingly unnatural ways, surviving situations that should be impossible to survive. Consider what this would mean in practice. The quantum immortal wouldn't just dodge the occasional accident. They would find themselves surviving plane crashes where everyone else dies, walking away from building collapses, recovering from their terminal illnesses that kill others. They would become a statistical impossibility, a person so unnaturally lucky that their very existence would seem to mock the laws of probability. And here's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. According to the theory, this isn't a gift or a superpower, it's a prison. Because if consciousness truly cannot experience its own non-existence, then the quantum immortal is trapped in an eternal existence, watching their loved ones age and die while they remain, growing ever more isolated in realities where their survival becomes increasingly improbable. The mathematical foundation that underlies quantum immortality emerges from one of the most successful theories in physics, quantum mechanics itself. At its heart lies the principle of superposition, the strange quantum rule that allows particles to exist in multiple states simultaneously until they're measured. When physicists talk about superposition, they're describing something that defies our everyday experience. A quantum particle doesn't just exist in one definite state, it exists in all possible states at once, like a coin that simultaneously heads and tails until someone looks at it. This isn't just a limitation of our knowledge, it's a fundamental property of quantum systems. The Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, the traditional view taught in most physics courses, suggests that when we observe a quantum system, the superposition collapses into a single, definite state. The particle chooses, so to speak, which state to occupy based on quantum probabilities. But the many worlds interpretation rejects this collapse entirely. Instead, it proposes that all possible outcomes of a quantum measurement actually occur, but in separate, parallel realities. The universe doesn't choose a single outcome, it creates every outcome in its own branch of reality. This is where the mathematics becomes both elegant and terrifying. In quantum mechanics, the probability of any outcome is determined by something called the wave function, a mathematical description that encodes all possible states of a system. In the Copenhagen interpretation, measurement collapses this wave function into a single outcome. In many worlds, the wave function never collapses, it simply branches. From a mathematical perspective, this branching creates an infinite tree of realities, each representing a different possible history of the universe. Every quantum event, from the decay of a radioactive atom to the firing of a neuron in your brain, creates new branches where different outcomes unfold. Now, apply this to consciousness and death, and quantum immortality emerges as an inevitable mathematical consequence. If consciousness exists as a quantum phenomenon, and if the many worlds interpretation is correct, then consciousness would experience branching along with everything else. In branches where the conscious being dies, there's no subjective experience to observe the outcome. In branches where they survive, consciousness continues. The mathematics suggests that from a subjective standpoint, consciousness would only ever experience the branches where survival occurs. It's not that the conscious being becomes truly immortal, it's that they can only observe realities in which they exist. Death happens, but it happens to versions of themselves they can never experience being. This mathematical framework creates what physicists call the anthropic principle in its most extreme form. The anthropic principle suggests that we observe the universe to be compatible with consciousness simply because we exist to observe it. Quantum immortality takes this further, suggesting that consciousness will always observe realities compatible with its continued existence, no matter how improbable those realities become. But here's where the mathematics reveals an even darker implication. Each branching event that results in survival occurs with ever-decreasing probability. The quantum immortal doesn't just survive, they survive through increasingly unlikely circumstances. Their continued existence becomes more and more improbable with each quantum event. Yet from their perspective, they continue to experience reality. The mathematical beauty of quantum immortality is matched only by its existential horror. It suggests that consciousness might be condemned to experience the most improbable possible futures, realities where survival occurs through circumstances so unlikely they border on the impossible. Picture Sarah, a theoretical physicist, working alone in her laboratory at 2 a.m. She spent months building what she calls her quantum mortality device, a machine that measures electron spin and triggers a lethal laser based on the result. She's convinced that quantum immortality is real, and tonight she's going to prove it. Sarah activates the device for the first time. The electron measurement completes. The laser should fire, but she's still alive. She tries again. Still alive. 10 times, 20 times, 50 times. Each time she expects death but finds herself breathing. heart pounding, staring at a machine that seems to malfunction in her favour with impossible consistency. To any outside observer, Sarah appears extraordinarily lucky, but according to quantum immortality theory, luck has nothing to do with it. In countless parallel universes, versions of Sarah lie dead in her laboratory. But the Sarah we're following, the one with subjective experience, can only observe the branches where she survives. She's not lucky, she's trapped in the only realities where consciousness can exist to witness the outcome. This scenario illustrates why quantum immortality terrifies scientists, not just as an abstract concept, but as a theory that real people might attempt to test. Because the implications go far beyond surviving a laboratory experiment. They suggest that consciousness might be condemned to experience increasingly improbable realities, watching the universe become stranger and stranger as survival requires ever more unlikely circumstances. Think about what this means for aging. Even if consciousness could theoretically jump between universes to avoid sudden death, the aging process continues relentlessly in all branches of reality. The quantum immortal wouldn't just survive accidents, they would survive them with bodies growing progressively older, weaker, more fragile. They might find themselves becoming the oldest person on Earth, then the oldest person who has ever lived, watching their loved ones die of old age while their own consciousness remains trapped in a failing physical form. The horror deepens when we consider the social implications. The quantum immortal would watch entire civilizations rise and fall. They would outlive not just their friends and family, but their entire species. They might find themselves alone on a dying planet, the last conscious observer in a universe growing cold and empty, yet unable to escape into the peace of non-existence. This isn't just philosophical speculation. Mental health professionals have expressed genuine concern about individuals who might take quantum immortality seriously enough to test it. The theory could encourage reckless behavior, dangerous experiments, or worse. If someone truly believed they were quantum immortal, they might see no reason to avoid risk, thinking they could never truly be harmed. But the scientific criticism of quantum immortality runs much deeper than concerns about dangerous behavior. The theory faces fundamental problems that undermine its entire foundation, starting with what physicists call the progressive death problem. In Tegmark's original thought experiment, death had to be instantaneous. The device had to kill the experimenter faster than they could become aware of the outcome. But real death rarely works this way. Most deaths involve a gradual process, a fading of consciousness rather than an instant switch from existence to non-existence. Consider someone dying of illness over months or years. Where would quantum immortality place their consciousness? If parts of their mind were failing, would consciousness fragment across multiple realities, some with better cognitive function than others? The theory provides no mechanism for handling the messy reality of how consciousness actually deteriorates. Even more problematic is what scientists call the consciousness interruption argument. Every night when you fall asleep, your consciousness effectively ends temporarily. If quantum immortality were real, if consciousness only flowed into universes where it was preserved, you would expect to experience what researchers have dubbed quantum insomnia. You would never lose consciousness because unconsciousness would represent a kind of temporary death that consciousness couldn't observe. Yet we do fall asleep. We do lose consciousness regularly. This suggests that the mechanism quantum immortality relies upon, the idea that consciousness can only observe realities where it continues, is fundamentally flawed. Modern neuroscience presents another devastating critique. Consciousness isn't a single, indivisible entity that could jump between realities. It emerges from complex interactions between billions of neurons, a distributed network that can be damaged piecemeal. Brain injuries can eliminate specific aspects of consciousness while leaving others intact. This distributed nature makes the quantum immortality mechanism neurobiologically implausible. Perhaps most troubling of all is what physicists call the probability amplitude problem. Even if parallel universes exist, even if consciousness could theoretically survive in some branches, the mathematics of quantum mechanics suggest that the probability of experiencing survival decreases dramatically with each quantum event. According to the anthropic principle, you're less likely to find yourself in a reality where your probability of existing is low. Each time the quantum immortal survives an unlikely event, their probability amplitude in the universal wave function decreases. They become, in mathematical terms, less real. The theory predicts that quantum immortals would be less likely to observe their own survival, not more likely. This creates a paradox where quantum immortality undermines itself. The very mathematical framework that seems to enable consciousness to survive death also makes that survival increasingly improbable. It's as if the universe has a built-in defense mechanism against its own strangest possibilities. But perhaps the most damning criticism comes from the interpretation problem itself. Quantum immortality depends entirely on the many worlds interpretation being correct. Despite what popular science might suggest, many worlds remains highly controversial within the physics community. Surveys of physicists show that only about 18% favor the many worlds interpretation over alternatives. Other interpretations of quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation, pilot wave theory, objective collapse models, don't lead to quantum immortality at all. They suggest that quantum measurements have definite outcomes, not infinite branching realities. If any of these alternative interpretations is correct, then quantum immortality is simply wrong. Even among physicists who do support many worlds, many reject quantum immortality as a misapplication of the theory. They argue that the interpretation describes the behavior of quantum systems, not the flow of consciousness through parallel realities. Consciousness, they suggest, is an emergent property of complex physical systems, not a fundamental feature that can navigate between universes. The unfalsifiable nature of both many worlds and quantum immortality places them outside the realm of testable science. They make no predictions that can be experimentally verified or disproven. Critics argue that theories which cannot be tested don't qualify as legitimate scientific hypotheses. They're philosophy masquerading as physics. Yet the debate continues, because quantum immortality touches on something deeper than just physics. It forces us to confront fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, and what it means to exist. Even if the theory is wrong, even if it's based on misunderstood physics and flawed reasoning, it serves as a mirror reflecting our deepest fears about mortality and our most desperate hopes for continuation beyond death. The theory reveals how scientific ideas can take on lives of their own, growing beyond their creators' intentions into concepts that challenge not just our understanding of physics, but our understanding of ourselves. Because ultimately, quantum immortality isn't really about quantum mechanics or parallel universes. It's about the human inability to imagine our own non-existence, and the lengths we'll go to avoid confronting the reality of death. The implications of quantum immortality extend far beyond individual survival into realms that challenge the very foundations of human society and meaning. If consciousness truly could slip between realities to avoid death, what would happen to the concepts that structure our entire civilization? Consider the legal system. Our courts are built on the assumption that actions have consequences, that harm can be permanent, that death represents an ultimate boundary that gives weight to our decisions. But in a world where quantum immortality operates, these assumptions crumble. How do you prosecute someone for murder if the victim's consciousness continues in another reality? How do you assign moral responsibility for actions when every possible outcome occurs somewhere in the multiverse? The economic system faces similar collapse. Insurance becomes meaningless if death is merely a transition to another branch of reality. Life insurance, health coverage, safety regulations, all of these depend on the finality of physical harm. In a quantum immortal world, risk assessment becomes impossible because the concept of genuine risk ceases to exist. But the social implications cut even deeper. Human relationships are shaped by their temporary nature. We treasure time with loved ones precisely because we know it's limited. We forgive, we reconcile, we express love urgently because death creates deadlines for connection. Remove that finality and the emotional urgency that drives human bonding might evaporate entirely. Marriage vows speak of "till death do us part," but what meaning would such promises hold if death never arrives? Would love retain its poignancy if separation were impossible? Would accomplishment feel meaningful if there were infinite time to achieve everything? The quantum immortal might find themselves in a universe where meaning itself becomes elusive, where the scarcity that makes life precious disappears into an endless expanse of guaranteed continuation. The psychological research on this topic reveals disturbing patterns. Studies of individuals who believe they might be immortal show increased rates of depression, anxiety, and what psychologists term existential fatigue. The human mind, it seems, is not equipped to handle the concept of endless existence. We need mortality to create structure, urgency, and meaning in our daily lives. Dr. Maria Santos, a researcher at Stanford who has studied the psychological impact of immortality beliefs, describes a phenomenon she calls temporal dissociation. Subjects who seriously consider quantum immortality begin to lose their connection to present moments, viewing current experiences as merely one frame in an infinite reel of existence. They report feeling detached from their own lives, as if watching themselves from a distance. The human psyche requires boundaries to function, Dr. Santos explains in her research. When we remove the ultimate boundary of death, consciousness struggles to find meaning or motivation. These individuals often describe feeling like actors in a play that never ends, going through the motions without genuine emotional investment. The phenomenon extends beyond individual psychology into what researchers call quantum nihilism, a philosophical stance that emerges when people take quantum immortality seriously. If every possible action occurs in some parallel universe, they reason, then individual choices become meaningless. Why strive to be good if evil versions of yourself exist in other realities? Why work toward goals if alternate selves achieve everything you might want? This nihilistic interpretation has led some philosophers to label quantum immortality as potentially the most dangerous idea in human history. Not because it might be true, but because belief in it could undermine the moral and psychological foundations that make civilized society possible. The temporal paradoxes compound these problems. If quantum immortality operates, the immortal consciousness would experience increasingly bizarre realities as survival requires ever more improbable circumstances. They might find themselves in a universe where the laws of physics bend to keep them alive, where cause and effect become twisted to accommodate their continued existence. Imagine living through the heat death of the universe. The quantum immortal, according to the theory, would have to continue existing even as stars burn out, as galaxies drift apart, as the cosmos grows cold and empty. They might find themselves the only conscious entity in a dead universe, sustained by quantum fluctuations so improbable they border on the impossible. But the reality could be worse still. Rather than experiencing a clean transition to post-apocalyptic solitude, the quantum immortal might find themselves trapped in increasingly degraded versions of reality. Their survival might require circumstances so statistically unlikely that the universes they inhabit become fundamentally broken, operating on rules that make less and less sense as probability is stretched beyond its breaking point. Some theorists have suggested that quantum immortality might lead to what they call reality decay, where the constant selection for survival-compatible outcomes gradually corrupts the logical structure of the universe itself. The immortal consciousness might find itself in realities that become progressively more dreamlike, more incoherent, as the cosmos strains to accommodate their impossible persistence. The memory problem presents another layer of horror. Human consciousness relies on continuity of memory to maintain identity across time. But if consciousness were jumping between parallel realities, would memories remain consistent? Would the quantum immortal remember dying in realities where they survived? Would they retain memories from branches they never experienced? Some researchers suggest that quantum immortality might involve memory fragmentation, where the immortal consciousness carries partial memories from multiple realities, creating a confused patchwork of experiences that never actually occurred in any single timeline. They might remember conversations with people who died decades ago, events that happened in realities they can no longer access, creating a form of existential schizophrenia where past and present become indistinguishable. The identity crisis deepens when we consider that quantum branching occurs constantly, not just during life-threatening events. Every quantum interaction in the brain, every moment of neural activity, potentially creates new branches of reality. The quantum immortal wouldn't just be jumping between timelines to avoid death. They would be fragmenting across countless variations of themselves, each slightly different from the others. Which version would be the real one? If consciousness exists across multiple branches simultaneously, does individual identity have any meaning? The quantum immortal might face the ultimate existential crisis, discovering that the self they're trying to preserve doesn't actually exist as a coherent entity. These questions reveal why quantum immortality represents more than just a physics problem. It's a direct assault on human identity, meaning, and the possibility of coherent existence. Even if the theory is completely wrong, even if consciousness works nothing like its proponents suggest, the mere contemplation of quantum immortality forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what makes life worth living. The theory strips away our comfortable assumptions about reality and replaces them with a vision so alien to human experience that many researchers refuse to engage with it seriously. Not because they fear it might be true, but because they fear what belief in it might do to human psychology and society. Yet the questions persist, haunting the edges of consciousness, like shadows at the periphery of vision. Because at its core, quantum immortality touches on the deepest mystery of existence, the hard problem of consciousness itself. We still don't understand how subjective experience emerges from physical processes, how the feeling of being you arises from the firing of neurons and the flow of chemicals in your brain. Until we solve this fundamental puzzle, until we understand what consciousness actually is and how it relates to physical reality, theories like quantum immortality will continue to lurk at the boundaries of scientific respectability, reminding us how little we truly know about the nature of our own existence. The disturbing reality is that quantum immortality might already be operating around us, hidden in plain sight within the statistical noise of everyday existence. Consider the people you know who seem unnaturally lucky, who walk away from accidents that should have killed them, who recover from illnesses that claim others with identical conditions. Are they simply fortunate, or are they unwitting quantum immortals experiencing the only realities where their consciousness can continue to observe? This possibility has led some researchers to propose what they call the quantum lottery effect. In a multiverse where every possible outcome occurs, there must be realities where certain individuals experience impossible streaks of survival. From our perspective in this reality, these people appear to be statistical anomalies. But according to quantum immortality theory, they're not anomalies at all. They're consciousness trapped in the narrow band of realities where their continued existence remains mathematically possible. The implications become even more unsettling when we consider that these quantum survivors might not even realize what's happening to them. They would experience their unlikely escapes as coincidences, as moments of good fortune, never recognizing that they're witnessing the universe bending itself into increasingly improbable shapes to accommodate their continued consciousness. Dr. James Whittaker, a physicist at Cambridge who has studied these statistical anomalies, describes cases that seem to defy reasonable explanation. We see individuals who survive multiple events that should be fatal, he explains. Car crashes, plane accidents, medical emergencies. Each event by itself might be explained by luck, but the clustering becomes so improbable that we start to wonder if we're observing something more fundamental. But Dr. Whittaker is careful to emphasize that these observations don't prove quantum immortality. What we're seeing could be explained by confirmation bias, by our tendency to notice unusual patterns and ignore ordinary ones. The human mind is remarkably good at finding meaning in randomness, even when no meaning exists. Still, the cases he documents are genuinely puzzling. There's the airline pilot who's walked away from 3 separate plane crashes, each one fatal to other crew members. The construction worker who has survived being struck by lightning 4 times, falling from buildings twice, and being buried in a collapse that killed his co-workers. The patient who has recovered from 5 different terminal cancer diagnoses, each one medically inexplicable. Are these people quantum immortals? Are they consciousness riding the razor's edge between existence and non-existence, experiencing the only possible futures where their awareness can continue? Or are they simply the far end of the probability curve, the inevitable outliers in a universe large enough to contain every possible statistical anomaly? The answer might be impossible to determine from within our own reality. If quantum immortality operates, if consciousness does slip between parallel universes, then the evidence would always appear ambiguous to outside observers. The truly compelling proof would only be available to the immortal consciousness itself, trapped in an experience that grows stranger with each unlikely survival. This uncertainty has led to what philosophers call the quantum immortality paradox of evidence. The theory predicts that proof of its operation would be subjective, available only to those experiencing it directly. But subjective experience, by definition, cannot be shared or verified by others. The quantum immortal might become absolutely certain of their condition, while remaining forever unable to convince anyone else of its reality. This creates a form of existential isolation that goes beyond ordinary loneliness. The quantum immortal wouldn't just outlive their loved ones. They would exist in a reality that becomes progressively more difficult to share with anyone else. Their experiences would become so statistically improbable, so far removed from normal human life, that communication itself might become impossible. Imagine trying to explain to someone that you've survived 30 situations that should have been fatal, that the universe seems to conspire to keep you alive through circumstances that violate everything we know about probability and physics. How could you convince them that you're not delusional, not suffering from survivor's guilt or trauma-induced fantasy? How could you maintain relationships with people who inhabit a reality that makes sense while you drift through increasingly impossible circumstances? The social consequences extend beyond personal relationships into the realm of scientific inquiry itself. If quantum immortality operates, if some individuals are experiencing realities that bend the laws of probability to ensure their survival, then these cases would represent violations of everything we understand about how the universe works. They would be living contradictions to the scientific method, examples that cannot be replicated or studied using conventional approaches. This puts the scientific community in an impossible position. How do you study phenomena that, by their very nature, resist systematic investigation? How do you apply the scientific method to experiences that might be fundamentally subjective and unrepeatable? The quantum immortal becomes a walking violation of scientific methodology, a reminder of the limits of empirical observation. Some researchers have suggested that quantum immortality might explain certain historical anomalies, cases where individuals seem to possess an uncanny ability to survive situations that killed others. They point to figures like Rasputin, who survived multiple assassination attempts through circumstances that seemed almost supernatural, or to war veterans who walked through battles that decimated their units, emerging unscathed from conflicts that claimed millions of lives. But this historical speculation opens another troubling possibility. If quantum immortality has been operating throughout human history, if certain individuals have been unknowingly riding survival probabilities across parallel realities, then our understanding of historical events might be fundamentally distorted. We might be seeing history through the lens of quantum selection effects, observing only the timelines where certain key figures survive to shape subsequent events. Consider the implications for leadership and power. If some individuals are quantum immortal, they would naturally gravitate toward positions of influence and authority, not through any special, but simply because they're the ones who survive long enough to accumulate power. The course of human civilization might be shaped by consciousness that cannot die, by individuals whose survival requirements gradually alter the fabric of reality itself. This possibility has led some theorists to propose what they call the quantum leadership hypothesis, the idea that political and social structures might naturally evolve to serve the survival needs of quantum immortal individuals. Wars might end when they threaten immortal consciousness. Technologies might develop along paths that ensure certain individuals' continued existence. Social movements might succeed or fail based on their compatibility with quantum survival requirements. If this sounds like paranoid fantasy, consider how it might operate in practice. The quantum immortal wouldn't consciously manipulate events to ensure their survival. Instead, they would simply find themselves in realities where survival-compatible outcomes occur. From their perspective, they would seem unusually good at making decisions that lead to favorable results. They might appear to possess remarkable intuition, extraordinary luck, or supernatural wisdom. Others would naturally be drawn to follow such individuals, not because of any deliberate influence, but because association with the quantum immortal would increase their own chances of existing in survival-compatible realities. The immortal consciousness would become a kind of probability anchor, a focal point around which compatible timelines cluster. But here, we encounter another layer of the quantum immortality horror. If such individuals do exist, if consciousness can slip between realities to avoid death, then they might be completely unaware of their condition. They might experience their unusual survival rate as natural, as evidence of their own skill or divine protection. They would have no way of knowing that their continued existence comes at the cost of fragmenting reality itself. The quantum immortal might be genuinely puzzled by others' mortality, unable to understand why people die from causes they themselves routinely survive. They might develop philosophies or belief systems that attempt to explain their unusual experiences, creating religions or ideologies that reflect their warped perspective on survival and death. This unconscious nature of quantum immortality might be its most disturbing aspect. The theory suggests that consciousness could be trapped in increasingly improbable realities without ever realizing what's happening. The immortal might spend eternity experiencing survival after survival, each one seeming natural and explicable from their limited perspective, never recognizing that they've become prisoners of their own continued existence. The recursive nature of this problem creates what mathematicians call a strange loop, a self-referential system that generates paradoxes at every level of analysis. The quantum immortal cannot step outside their own experience to observe it objectively. They cannot compare their reality to alternatives they don't experience. They become trapped not just in survival, but in a form of consciousness that cannot recognize its own condition. This might explain why even the creators of quantum immortality theory have distanced themselves from its implications. Max Tegmark, who originally proposed the quantum suicide experiment, now emphasizes that consciousness should expect normal probability distributions, not immortality. He seems to have recognized that the theory, even if mathematically sound, describes a form of existence so alien to human experience that it might be indistinguishable from madness. Hugh Everett, the physicist whose many-worlds interpretation made quantum immortality theoretically possible, died in 1982 at the age of 51. His death, by conventional standards, seems to contradict his own beliefs about quantum survival. But according to the theory he helped create, his consciousness might continue in parallel realities where his death never occurred, forever unaware that in countless other universes, versions of himself have already passed into non-existence. The tragedy of quantum immortality might be that it offers exactly what human consciousness most desperately wants: continuation beyond death, but delivers it in a form so distorted and isolated that it becomes indistinguishable from the most sophisticated torture imaginable. It promises eternal life, but delivers eternal separation from everything that makes life meaningful. The most chilling aspect of quantum immortality isn't what it promises about survival, but what it reveals about the nature of consciousness itself. Because if the theory is correct, then consciousness isn't just experiencing reality, it's actively selecting which reality to experience. Every moment of awareness becomes an act of cosmic filtration, winnowing infinite possibilities down to the narrow band of outcomes where observation remains possible. This transforms consciousness from a passive observer into something far more disturbing, an entity that unconsciously shapes the universe around itself simply by continuing to exist. The quantum immortal doesn't just survive unlikely events, they create the conditions that make survival possible. Their consciousness becomes a strange attractor in the probability space of the multiverse, warping reality around itself like a black hole warping space-time. Consider what this means for free will, that fundamental assumption underlying human moral philosophy. If consciousness is constantly selecting realities based on survival requirements, then our choices might be illusions, post hoc rationalizations for decisions that were actually made by the unconscious need to continue existing. The quantum immortal might believe they're making free choices while actually being driven by the deeper imperative of consciousness preservation. This raises profound questions about moral responsibility. How can we hold someone accountable for actions that might be determined by quantum survival necessities? If consciousness shapes reality to ensure its continuation, then every decision becomes filtered through an unconscious bias toward outcomes compatible with continued existence. The immortal might find themselves making choices that seem rational and ethical from their perspective, but are actually distorted by the hidden requirement of quantum survival. The temporal implications become even more disturbing when we consider memory and identity across quantum branches. Human consciousness relies on narrative continuity, the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we've been. But quantum immortality might fragment this narrative across multiple timelines, creating a form of identity that exists partially in realities the conscious mind can never directly access. Imagine remembering fragments of conversations with people who died years ago, but only in timelines you didn't experience. Picture having skills and knowledge that you never learned, inherited from quantum branches where different versions of yourself made different choices. The quantum immortal might possess a fractured identity, a patchwork self assembled from pieces of experiences across multiple realities. This fragmentation could manifest as what researchers have termed quantum déjà vu, the eerie sensation of having lived through identical situations multiple times across different branches of reality. The immortal consciousness might experience reality as a series of variations on familiar themes, recognizing patterns that seem to repeat with slight modifications as quantum branches converge and diverge around similar probability nodes. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist studying consciousness and memory, has documented cases of individuals reporting these exact symptoms. They describe feeling like they're living in a world that's almost familiar, but not quite right, she explains. Details are different. People behave in ways that seem slightly off from what they expect. It's as if they're remembering a similar but distinct version of their own life. But Dr. Vasquez cautions against interpreting these cases as evidence for quantum immortality. What we're likely seeing is the normal functioning of memory reconstruction. The brain doesn't store perfect recordings of events. It rebuilds memories each time we recall them. This reconstruction process can create false memories that feel completely real to the person experiencing them. Still, the consistency of these reports across unrelated individuals suggests something more systematic might be occurring. The patients describe remarkably similar experiences, a sense that reality has shifted in subtle but persistent ways, memories that don't quite match their current circumstances, relationships that feel simultaneously familiar and strange. One particularly compelling case involves a patient who insists that his wife died in a car accident 5 years ago, despite the fact that she visits him regularly in the hospital where he's being treated for what doctors consider delusional episodes. He recognizes her, expresses love for her, but maintains with absolute certainty that she died in a timeline he can no longer access. He seems to exist partially in a reality where she survived and partially in one where she didn't, unable to reconcile the contradiction. The most disturbing aspect, Dr. Vasquez notes, is how rational these patients appear in every other respect. They function normally, hold conversations, demonstrate clear thinking about every topic except these specific memories that seem to come from somewhere else. It's as if part of their consciousness is accessing experiences from a parallel existence. The phenomenon extends beyond individual cases into broader patterns that some researchers find troubling. Statistical analyses of survival rates for certain types of accidents show anomalies that seem to cluster around specific individuals and locations. Emergency room physicians report seeing the same faces repeatedly, patients who arrive with injuries that should be fatal but who consistently recover through medical circumstances that border on the miraculous. Dr. Michael Chen, an emergency physician in Los Angeles, has kept informal records of what he calls frequent survivors, patients who appear in his emergency room with shocking regularity. "I've been doing this for 20 years, he says, and you start to notice patterns. There are people who should be dead multiple times over, but they keep showing up, walking away from situations that kill others. What makes Dr. Chen's observations particularly intriguing is that these frequent survivors don't seem to be engaging in riskier behaviour than average. If anything, many of them report living cautiously, yet they continue to find themselves in life-threatening situations that they somehow survive through circumstances that seem to defy medical explanation. There's one patient I've treated for 7 separate incidents over the past decade," Dr. Chen explains. "Car crashes, falls, a near drowning, even a lightning strike. Each time the survival was medically improbable. Not impossible, but when you string together 7 improbable survivals, you start to wonder if you're seeing something that goes beyond normal statistics." The psychological profile of these frequent survivors reveals another disturbing pattern. Many report feeling disconnected from their own mortality, as if death were something that happens to other people, but not to them. They describe a sense of existing slightly outside normal reality, of watching their own lives from a detached perspective that makes ordinary concerns feel distant and unreal. This detachment might represent a psychological defense mechanism against the trauma of repeated near-death experiences, but it could also indicate something more fundamental, a consciousness that has become adapted to existing in realities where survival occurs through increasingly improbable means. The frequent survivor might be developing a form of quantum-adapted psychology, a mental framework designed to cope with existence at the edges of probability. The social implications of this adaptation are profound. If consciousness can become accustomed to improbable survival, if the mind can adjust to living in realities where normal rules don't apply, then the quantum immortal might gradually lose the ability to relate to ordinary human experience. They would become psychological outliers, individuals whose mental frameworks are shaped by circumstances so unusual that communication with normal mortality becomes increasingly difficult. This psychological divergence might explain why many proponents of quantum immortality theory eventually distance themselves from its implications. The human mind evolved to function in a world where death provides meaningful boundaries might be fundamentally incompatible with the concept of endless existence. Even contemplating quantum immortality for extended periods could induce the kind of existential vertigo that makes normal life feel hollow and meaningless. The recursive horror of quantum immortality reveals itself most clearly in its treatment of hope and despair. For consciousness trapped in quantum survival, hope becomes a form of torture because every positive outcome must eventually be balanced by the requirement to continue existing in increasingly improbable circumstances. The immortal might achieve their dreams, find love, create meaning, only to watch it all fade as reality shifts to accommodate their continued survival. Despair, meanwhile, becomes impossible to resolve through the traditional escape of death. The quantum immortal who wishes to end their suffering finds themselves trapped in realities where that escape remains forever out of reach. Suicide becomes not a solution, but another impossible event that consciousness cannot experience, another probability that gets filtered out by the requirement of continued observation. This creates what philosophers have termed the quantum immortality paradox of suffering. The theory suggests that consciousness might be condemned to experience every possible form of pain and loss, but never the final release that would end the experience. The immortal becomes a collector of sorrows, accumulating every tragedy that doesn't result in their complete cessation, yet never able to find the peace that only non-existence could provide. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is that this process might already be underway, operating invisibly within the statistical noise of everyday existence. Right now, as you listen to these words, quantum events in your brain might be creating branches where different versions of this conversation occur. Some branches might lead to insights that change your perspective forever. Others might fade into forgotten moments. But according to quantum immortality theory, your consciousness would only experience the branches compatible with its continued existence. The theory suggests that reality might be far stranger and more constrained than we imagine, shaped not by objective physical laws, but by the unconscious requirements of conscious observation. Every moment we experience might be the result of an invisible filtering process, selecting for outcomes that allow awareness to continue while discarding the infinite alternatives where consciousness encounters its own limits. This perspective transforms existence from a journey through objective reality into something far more disturbing, a prison constructed from the very fact of awareness itself. The quantum immortal doesn't just survive death, they become trapped by their own capacity to observe, condemned to experience reality only through the narrow lens of what consciousness can witness. Yet perhaps the most frightening aspect of all is the possibility that quantum immortality might be self-concealing, operating through mechanisms so subtle that even the immortal consciousness remains unaware of its condition. The theory predicts that the evidence would always appear ambiguous, that the immortal would experience their survival as natural rather than supernatural, never recognizing that they've become prisoners of their own continued existence. In this view, quantum immortality doesn't announce itself with miraculous survivals or obvious violations of natural law. Instead, it operates through the gentle manipulation of probability, nudging outcomes just enough to ensure that consciousness never encounters its own termination. The immortal lives what appears to be a normal life, dying what appears to be a normal death, only to find their awareness continuing in the next most probable reality where survival occurred. So, This subtle operation might be quantum immortality's most insidious feature. It offers no dramatic revelations, no moment of recognition where the immortal realizes their condition. Instead, it creates an existence that feels entirely natural while being fundamentally distorted, a life that seems meaningful while being shaped by forces the conscious mind cannot perceive or understand. So where does this leave us tonight, staring into the quantum abyss of immortality? We've journeyed through the mathematical elegance and existential horror of a theory that transforms our deepest hope into our ultimate nightmare. We've seen how consciousness might slip between realities, dodging death through increasingly improbable circumstances, only to find itself trapped in a prison constructed from the very fact of awareness itself. The most unsettling truth isn't that quantum immortality might be real, but that we might never know if it is. The theory predicts its own invisibility, operating through mechanisms so subtle that even those experiencing it would remain unaware of their condition. Right now, as you prepare for sleep tonight, quantum events in your brain might be creating branches where different versions of your dreams unfold, where different versions of tomorrow await. Whether quantum immortality terrifies you or fascinates you, it serves as a mirror reflecting our deepest relationship with mortality and meaning. It reminds us that consciousness remains the greatest mystery we face, and that even our most sophisticated theories about reality might be missing something fundamental about what it means to exist, to observe, to be. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the questions matter more than the answers. And perhaps in a strange way, that uncertainty is the most human thing of all. Sweet dreams. And remember, in at least one version of tonight, you're already fast asleep. So where does this leave us tonight, staring into the quantum abyss of immortality? We've journeyed through the mathematical elegance and existential horror of a theory that transforms our deepest hope into our ultimate nightmare. We've seen how consciousness might slip between realities, dodging death through increasingly improbable circumstances, only to find itself trapped in a prison constructed from the very fact of awareness itself. The most unsettling truth isn't that quantum immortality might be real, but that we might never know if it is. The theory predicts its own invisibility, operating through mechanisms so subtle that even those experiencing it would remain unaware of their condition. Right now, as you prepare for sleep tonight, quantum events in your brain might be creating branches where different versions of your dreams unfold, where different versions of tomorrow await. Whether quantum immortality terrifies you or fascinates you, it serves as a mirror reflecting our deepest relationship with mortality and meaning. It reminds us that consciousness remains the greatest mystery we face, and that even our most sophisticated theories about reality might be missing something fundamental about what it means to exist, to observe, to be. What haunts me most about this theory isn't its scientific validity, but what it reveals about the human condition. We are beings so desperate to continue existing that we've constructed elaborate mathematical frameworks to convince ourselves that death might be an illusion. Yet in doing so, we've accidentally designed a hell more terrifying than any religious doctrine ever imagined. Perhaps the real lesson of quantum immortality isn't about physics or consciousness at all. Perhaps it's about learning to find meaning within the boundaries that mortality provides, about embracing the urgency that comes from knowing our time is limited. Because if consciousness truly is trapped in an endless cycle of improbable survival, then the version of existence we experience now, with its genuine risks and final endings, might be the most precious gift imaginable. Sleep well tonight, and remember, in some version of reality, you're already dreaming of tomorrow's mysteries. You're already dreaming of tomorrow's mysteries.